Hello, today is April 30th, 2025, last day of April, um, on a Wednesday. And I'll once again be reading from the United Church of Christ daily devotional, providing my thoughts and impressions, the things that the devotion raised in me as using a Christian text as a way to discuss life in our world today, whether you're whatever faith tradition or no faith tradition that you are, however you may interpret it, but simply using this Christian writing as a stepping off point for conversation. The devotion I'll be reading today is entitled Defense, and it's written by Quinn G. Caldwell. And Quinn bases the devotion upon the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, verses 10 through 11, New Revised Standard Version, adapted from the New Revised Standard Version. Jesus said, "And everyone who speaks a word against the Son of Humanity will be forgiven, but whoever blasphemes against the Spirit will not be forgiven. When they bring you before the synagogues, the rulers, and the authorities, do not worry about how you are to defend yourselves or what you are to say, for the Holy Spirit will teach you at that very hour what you ought to say." And then Quinn writes, Jesus is anticipating trouble for his followers. "Deny me if you must," he says, "but don't you dare don't you dare deny the way God works in the world. We don't know how many people, laboring under the persecutions that did indeed come, eventually did what Jesus warned against and recanted their faith. Instead, we have stories of those who didn't, the saints and heroes and martyrs who trembled but stood firm. Stephen, Paul, Perpetua, Felicitas. It may be time to revisit some of their stories, and the stories of less ancient ones too. Anne Hutchinson, the Public Universal Friend, Oscar Romero, Carter Hayward, Dan Berrigan, plus whatever name you just yelled at your screen when you realized I'd left out your favorite. If a council or a power demands you account for your belief that trans people deserve to thrive, will you be able to tell them how God's actions in your life led you to that belief? What about your commitment to the preservation of creation, the welcome and humane treatment of immigrants and refugees, the rights of women to control their own bodies? Will you be able to tell them how you know God demands these things? Jesus says the Spirit will tell you what to say if the time comes, but it might not hurt to study up a little ahead of time anyway. And then Quinn's prayer. Give me the words and the courage to proclaim you everywhere I go. Well, a couple thoughts I had on this. One is I was reading something earlier in the day from the Christian Century magazine, and they were talking about Matthew 25. And even if you don't regularly read the Bible, go and read the Gospel of Matthew chapter 25 all the way to the end and see what it says to you about things today. But it reminded me that, according to the scriptures, not that I necessarily believe that there's going to be a judgment at the end of the world. I think there's judgment every single day. How nations will be judged by God in the final counting. And it all comes down to having empathy and compassion for the most marginalized in our midst. And I think that I see that message over and over and over again. And I also see, even in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, elements of God's empathy and compassion winning out over whatever anger those stories seem to depict God has. So I really think that empathy and compassion for others, for the most vulnerable in our midst, for those escaping inhumane conditions, for the destruction of our world, physical world, our creation, all those things, I think Jesus, if you believe, had embodied the very essence of God, or was God, whatever your thoughts are on that. He was always about having compassion and empathy to those most vulnerable around him. I also think of the feeding story, the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, depending upon which gospel you're reading. And I think it was Luke, when there was thousands around him, and the people were hungry, and Jesus said to feed them, and the disciples were like, "Well, there's like way too many people here. We don't have enough money to buy food for all these people." And Jesus kind of got angry and just said, "You feed them. No excuses. No ifs, ands, or buts. You feed them." And I don't know, it just makes me think of our world today, and all the things, especially our nation, that's going on, that's depriving the most vulnerable among us from being seen as God's beloved, being treated much less than God's beloved, and it's awful. So the question comes, when things get really bad, and when you see things really bad, are you willing to stand up and say something? And if you're a person of faith, are you willing to study up and to defend yourself with those elements of your faith that demand that you have empathy and compassion for your fellow human beings, your fellow creation, the people, the animals, the insects, the whole world around you? Are you willing to do the work, and do you have the courage to stand up and say enough's enough and begin to make change? Anyway, those are my thoughts that are raised in me as I read this, and I hope they've given you some things to think about in this day, and perhaps some courage to take steps you need to take for yourself as well as for those around you who you see need the help that we can give, and be the living presence of the divine, of God, to them. Anyway, my thoughts for the day. Hope you have a good one. Talk to you soon.